Good evening and welcome to More Than One Way to Skin a Building. I'd like to begin the evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the Wurundjeri, and pay respects to their elders and families past and present. My name is Justine Clark and I'm the chair for this evening's event. It's wonderful to see that so many of you are here, and we're looking forward to a very fascinating discussion about the opportunities and challenges of online media for critical discourse and the built environment. This evening's event is the first in a new series presented by the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning here at the University of Melbourne. It's called ABP Agenda, and these events will present a broad range of people and practices engaged in transforming the way that we think, talk about and make our built environments. So there'll be further events in this series, and they'll be promoted through their ABP website, their Twitter account, and various other means. So keep an eye out for those as they come up. So the faculty is delighted to welcome Alexandra Lange as the inaugural speaker in this series. Alexandra is an architecture and design critic based in New York. She's a regular contributor to Places on Design Observer, which is, to my mind, one of the very best online publications about architecture and design. And her writing has also appeared in the Architect's Newspaper, Architectural Record, Dwell, Metropolis, Print, New York Magazine, and the New York Times. She's also a great tweeter, and I always stop scrolling when I catch sight of her bright yellow avatar to see what she's doing and saying. Alexandra is also the author of the recent book, Writings About Architecture, Mastering the Language of Buildings and Cities. And she's co-author of the earlier book, Design Research, the store that brought modern living to American homes. She teaches architecture criticism at the DCRIT program at the School of Visual Arts in New York and at the Urban Design and Architecture Studies program at NYU. So welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Alexandra will be joined tonight in conversation by an illustrious panel of our own critics and writers. Dr. Karen Burns is an architectural theorist and historian and a senior lecturer here at the University of Melbourne. She is also a long-time and highly respected editor, critic, and a key participant in Australia's architectural culture and discourse. Karen edited Transition from 1986 to 1991 with Harriet Edquist, and her essays on architectural history and theory and reviews of new architecture have been published nationally and internationally. She was also an invited contributor to the last issue of the late great journal Assemblage. Karen also has a long-standing interest in feminist theory and activism, and she's currently a chief investigator on the Australian Research Council funded project, which is looking into issues of gender equity in architecture. She's a co-editor and contributor to Parlour, Women, Equity in Architecture, the website that we've established as the public face of that project. And it was Karen who came up with the name Parlour. So better or worse. Michael Holt, on the end, is the new editor of Architecture Review Asia Pacific. He's now based in Sydney, but before that he was a practicing architect and critic in New York. He graduated from Columbia, and he also contributes to Metropolis, Blueprint, Columbia's C-Lab and BI blog, and together with Marissa Luby, he contributes the Elements series to the Domus Online. Michael's taught in the UK and at Columbia, and he's currently teaching a master's studio at UTS in Sydney. And we should also acknowledge that Architecture Review Asia Pacific are the media partners for this event, and the faculty greatly appreciates their involvement and their support. Last but not least, Rory Hyde is a practicing architect and a researcher who's engaged in architectural discourse through various platforms. He's recently returned to Melbourne, and we're very fortunate to have him back. Rory is on the editorial team of the Dutch journal Volume. He's a contributing editor to Architecture Australia and a regular contributor to AR Asia Pacific and to the Huffington Post. He's just had his first piece published in Domus, Twitter told me today. And he's also the co-host of the Architects Radio Show, which was exhibited at the 2012 Venice Biennale. He's the author of the book Future Practice, Conversations from the Edge of Architecture, which I have seen on many architects' bedside tables. Oh, one architect's bedside table, many architects' offices. One architect's bedside table, I have seen it. And is this semester running, it wasn't...
Intimate.
He's running a master's studio here at Melbourne University. And why am I here other than to make a fool of myself? Well, I believe that I was invited to chair the event as I've been going on about criticism for quite a few years now. I was the editor of Architecture Australia for 7 years, and now I edit the website Parlour, among many other things. And I'm also an honorary senior research fellow here at the University of Melbourne. We also have many great critics, editors, bloggers, and architects in the audience, who I was very impressed when I saw the list. So I'm looking forward to some productive discussion when we open up to the audience at the end of the session. So I'd ask you all, as you're listening to the discussion, to please start formulating interesting and succinct questions and comments. And if you want to tweet, use the hashtag ABPAgenda. So, more than one way to skin a building. Our event takes its name from the delicious title, I think, of the last chapter of Alexandra's book, Writing About Architecture. For me, this evocatively captures what I think is one of the most important lessons of her book, namely that there's no one right way to write criticism. Now, this might seem like a blindingly obvious point, but it's one that seems to keep needing restating again and again, and I think Alexandra's book, by guiding us through the work of a whole series of critics, makes that point very well and very carefully. I think it's very important. Alexandra also uses her book to open up the potential of different modes of criticism, and she wants us all to be able to talk intelligently about the city and the buildings and spaces that make it, so that we might all actively contribute to that making. She writes, "Instead of less talk, what we need are more critics, citizen critics, equipped with the desire and the vocabulary to remake the city." Oh, here we go. Okay, more than one way to skin a building is also the chapter where Alexandra begins to talk about the potential of online environments in building communities of criticism. And it's from that comment that I think we want to kick off tonight's discussion. We're aiming for a fluid and informal discussion. We're going to begin with a short talk from Alexandra, then each of our panellists will give a short response to that. And I think after that we'll have very fertile ground for panel discussion. And at an appropriate moment, we'll open to the floor. So please join me in welcoming Alexandra.
Well, thank you so much to the University of Melbourne for having me and for Justine for inviting me. And I also have to say thank you to the Hawke Research Seminar at the University of South Australia for bringing me the long way to Australia. I was in Adelaide last night speaking on a similar panel, and it's really exciting to see what a hot topic criticism is in Australia. So I will say the first panel I was ever asked to be on about the state of architectural criticism was in the spring of 2011, 2 short years ago, which was at the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York City. I can't remember much about that night now, except that I was freezing because the Storefront is a tiny space open to the street, and March in New York can be very cold. But I do remember that a sizable chunk of that evening was devoted to discussing whether or not the move to digital publishing would kill criticism. Some panelists argued that only in print could architectural criticism flourish, and online writing was too ephemeral. 2 years later, I feel that that conversation could not happen. The revolution of the turn from print into digital media, whether parallel or singular, has happened, and that question is completely moot. And I'm happy to say, even then, as a late adopter, I knew that there was something wrong with that argument. Those editors were obviously confusing the medium with the message, and the medium was and is in a state of massive flux. If architectural criticism could only exist in print, it was an endangered species. Even so, when I was writing my book, Writing About Architecture, and please note that the editors at Princeton Architectural Press wouldn't let me put the word criticism in the title. The editors then asked me if I could do a chapter on an architectural blog, but I declined. Blogging, I felt, was a form in itself, and it can definitely be critical, but isolating a single post, as I had with the other essays reprinted in my book, wasn't really fair to the form. A post is not intended as a self-contained unit, but as a part of an ongoing dialogue between the blog's author and readers, or the publication and readers, not to mention the blogger's shorthand of hyperlinks, which means that read offline, things frequently require further explanation. One becomes familiar with a blogger's interests, his or her style, and all bloggers and commentators come to speak in a kind of collective shorthand. A blog post can become an essay, but it doesn't have to be one to make its point. A critical essay, by my definition, is a piece of writing that can stand alone. It can be understood as of its own time, but also out of its time, and is interesting even if it's about a building or a project or a place that you will never see. It doesn't need photographs, and it gives you some feeling of the atmosphere of the real thing. But just as there is more than one way to skin a building, there's more than one way to speak critically, incisively, and publicly about architecture. And I'm going to talk today about a few of those ways. The first one is Twitter. Now, I don't think I would be here talking to you necessarily without Twitter. Because for all of my love of long-form writing, I also love Twitter. Twitter allows me to broadcast links to all of the things that I write in one place. I'm a freelancer, and without Twitter, people wouldn't know where to find me. It also lets me, wisecrack about the latest design blog memes. I have a personal thing about anything related to shipping containers and urban farms. I also like to share the writings of other people that I admire, to chat with like-minded complete strangers. In the print era, criticism was legitimized by institutions like city newspapers and national magazines. But when I did a poll on Twitter last year, we could only identify 11.5 newspaper critics left in North America. And the 0.5 is Philip Kennicott, an excellent critic who writes for the Washington Post. But he is both their art and architecture critic. So we only gave him a 0.5. And there are a handful of others that work for mainstream magazines like Vanity Fair or New York Magazine. So those people and those print publications aren't really enough to represent architecture culture. And so the conversation really has to be continued elsewhere and by people who may not have the same institutional backing. And I've always been very suspicious of the advice given to young journalists today to establish your personal brand on social media. However, I recently realized that I think I inadvertently did that. I like being able to show all of the things that architecture and design critics are interested in, what informs what I choose to write about, and also what informs the critical way I go about everything in my life. I really think that critics are born and not made, and the skepticism with which I approach a new building equals the skepticism with which I approach things like pink, ruffly girls' clothes for my daughter. I'm careful not to be too personal, I think. I try to avoid the Facebook post, but I do think that people now feel that they know me because they understand my larger field of interests. And I think that that leads to things like invitations to fly halfway around the world. And in the old days, I do think that many people in a specific city felt like they had that kind of relationship with their newspaper critic. Over the years, they came to know them. They wrote letters. There was a back and forth. And as newspaper critics disappear, we have to find new ways to have that kind of long-term relationship. And I've said this before, but I think that online we can create communities of common concerns. In the old days, the city would be a locus, and I think that's really still the most important one. But I've personally, given my range of interests, have found communities of people who are interested in design for children, who are interested in the design of the modern home, who are interested in the way technology can and cannot make life easier. And platforms like Twitter also allow these communities of critics to support each other through retweets, through invitations. And I think all of us who are online savvy essentially are now creating our own design magazines through services like Instapaper. If you subscribe to a Twitter feed and you get all of your friends and acquaintances' design reviews, put them all into Instapaper, you've essentially created your own online design magazine. And being able to dissemble the structure puts more emphasis on good writing rather than less. I also think that Twitter is a great place for criticism. One way to skin the building is to type the first comment that appears into your head upon seeing an image in your stream. Now, Michael Beirut, the esteemed graphic designer and design writer who works for Pentagram in New York, recently published a piece on Design Observer arguing against such drive-by criticism and even up-down voting on things like the brand new blog. But by not respecting the process and looking at the whole design system, he said that we dumb the profession down. But I wouldn't want Twitter to be the only venue for criticism. But how long do people spend on the threshold of a building? How long does it take them to take that first impression? 140 characters is not a bad beginning if it's not also the end. And you can get a surprising amount of information into 140 characters if you know how to write. A little Twitter free-for-all indicates that a building has touched a nerve and gives everyone a chance to add to the conversation in a public forum. I often use Twitter conversations as an indication of a topic that I should look into in greater depth. Architecture takes a long time, but at some moments it is news, and I like having that news as part of my stream. I mentioned earlier that I thought Twitter created communities. Follow lists of architecture critics are one way of creating such a community. And in those communities, a freelancer like me gets treated as an equal to those with full-time employment. There are other types of communities that have been created by online media also. One way that seems particularly successful at cutting through the noise is a sort of monomania. Historically, critics have been journalists and have sort of had to take their topics as they came from what buildings were built in their cities, or the economics, politics, and construction schedules. But the freedom of the web allows people to specialize in much more interesting ways. I'm thinking of someone like Aaron Naperstek, who was a journalist interested in urban issues when I first met him, but he founded the blog Streets Blog, which is now a national network of blogs devoted to news and opinion about matters relating to traffic, pedestrians, bike lanes, all very hot topics, at least in the US, I don't know about here. So he found a way to turn his interests into a new kind of critical publication, one that gets criticism out from the outmoded stereotype of being only building reviews. I think Justine and Karen have done a similar thing with Parlor, where it's a community of people interested in work life and gender issues relating to architecture. And even Rory's book, I believe, developed out of a blog post, which again brought people together around the issue of what future practice would be. And you see a similar structure behind a project like CLOG, which is a journal started by some graduates of the Yale School of Architecture and the SVA program in which I teach. Each issue of CLOG has a theme, and the editors call for 500-word pieces on that theme. Their first theme was the work of Bjarke Ingels, and I contributed to that one, revising a blog post I'd written about his 8-house in Copenhagen and some of the unanswered questions I had about how it actually worked. I would add as a parenthesis that I think those questions are still unanswered. After that, they did an issue devoted to Apple, which sold out and had to be reprinted, one on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., one on brutalism, and they have a forthcoming issue coming out on sci-fi. they've been incredibly canny about picking up on popular memes in the larger architecture culture that, in a sense, people are already writing and talking about. 500 words is basically a blog post, but these pieces are very well written. They're long enough for about one good point, and they are properly footnoted. As a cumulative, collective effort, these issues work as a deeper commentary. And I think all of the posts collected in CLOG might have been written elsewhere, but it's incredibly handy to have them all in one place, and I think it creates a little bit of competition among the writers that causes them to up their game. That's not to say that all is rosy now that so much of architecture culture connects online. There's still the problem of being there. When traditional print publications hired an architecture critic, they also provided a budget for travel to works of architecture. I get paid less for almost all of my writing that only exists online, and I don't work for anyone who will send me where I want to go. Last year, I wrote an ebook on Silicon Valley for Strelka Press, essentially a very long article, about 7,000 words, but I broke even on it. The advance that they gave me covered my travel, and I'm supposed to get 50% of the sales, but there haven't been enough sales yet for them to give me my 50%. So maybe the institutional supports of old publishing do count for more than we realize. Local critics can cover their own territory, and in many cases that is preferable, that kind of concentration. But what about cities without a critical community? What about other opinions? I mean, isn't it more fun to read 3 reviews of a building than just one? And as more architecture publications just rely on photos because they're free, the knowledge base for criticism goes down. Second, there seems to be a persistent equivalence in discussing criticism in the digital realm that criticism is negative. And despite all appearances, the digital realm doesn't necessarily reward negativity. A checklist on how to be successful on Twitter, for example, said it's better to be positive and to never complain. The most popular design and architecture blogs, many of which I'm sure you follow, tend to be relentlessly positive. I'm thinking of things like Fast Company Design, which seems to publish a new Save the Planet via design idea every day. As everyone in this room probably knows, criticism doesn't have to be negative, and I tell my students that even the most positive review has to have a paragraph of critique, or your readers will think that you're asleep at the switch. I call it a little pepper. It's actually more difficult to write cogently about something you love than something you hate, which is why I'm always happy when I see a site trying to mix history in with the new thing. But as I also often feel the need to point out, all of those people who don't want to say anything negative are making critical judgments all of the time. That's the only way they could only put things that they love on their sites. They just aren't telling us about those critical judgments. Just as criticism can illuminate what went into making a building, it could also illuminate the making of popular taste via design blogs, architecture blogs, Tumblr, and Pinterest. This may be the next frontier for criticism, using the visual tools of the internet to tell a critical story. I found it enriching, for example, to Instagram my recent trips to exhibitions and buildings as a way of sharing my first cut, publicizing something interesting, and also teasing a longer piece that I'm going to write later. I see graduate students with Tumblrs where they publish images every day from their research as a sort of daily log of their best discoveries. I wish I'd had this when I was working on my own dissertation, because I can't tell you the number of times I had to dive back into my Xeroxes and folders in my filing cabinet. If I'd had Tumblr, I would have been able to search. Can Pinterest be used critically? I'd love to see someone try, if only, as I've argued, to prove that it is not the platform that is feminine, consumer-driven, et cetera, but only its early adopters. A renewed focus on how visuals are used would also start a deeper dialogue about the power of the rendering in architecture today. That's another topic that CLOG has devoted an issue to, and one that I find particularly pressing. How many cases, for example, the rendering supersedes the final product? As as architecture, culture, and criticism move online, all aspects of it have to engage in dialogue and be examined as potential critical tools. It's no longer about blogs versus print, or even an essay versus a post, as I wrote in my book. All these forms are happening simultaneously, and I think we're still figuring out how to use them. Thank you.
So I think one of the most interesting things about the conversation is I feel like we're all just finding our way as we go. I think that's quite liberating for someone who worked on a very institutionalised publication for a long time. I guess I'm going to ask all our panellists to respond to you in a minute, but I think I'd make one point in that the Australian context is quite different to the US in that we've never had newspaper critics who have jobs.
Yes.
People who might write about architecture in the newspaper occasionally, but they're in freelance situations. We've never had the critic who's been paid. And the people who write for professional publications, or they're academics, they're practitioners, you can't make a living out of writing criticism. I don't think you've ever been able to. Maybe things can change, but I think that's quite a different situation than the US, where you've had this kind of, and the UK, there are people who are critics in newspapers. People who are critics in Australia are also academics, they're also practitioners, they're also other things. But I'd like to go around our panellists now, and I might start with Dr. Hyde.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, in a way, no, we've never had a sort of regular newspaper critic who's got that authority or respect, or that we get to know, like you described. But we have had, the Architecture Australia may play that role in being the journal of record and covering the new buildings as they come through. And what struck me as interesting in this shift to online, or this kind of rupture that we've recently had, is that this assumption that the sort of core element of architectural publishing is the building review has been shown to be a kind of something completely tied to print. And that in the shift to online, through whether it's either a blog or an online magazine, you just do not see a building reviewed in the same way that you would have seen in a magazine. I mean, people just don't. I find it, when I come across it, it's often like somebody saying, hey, this guy reviewed a building. Like, you kind of make a point out of it. It became this, the communities was one big sort of aspect in my experiences as somebody who blogs irregularly, but, does all the Twitter and all the rest. And I think what's interesting is that when those newspaper critics or the magazine critics, or this form that was tied to a media of the building review became overrun, or once they lost that monopoly, the definition of architecture changed. So it no longer was about the building, which had a defined site which we could take a photograph of and catalogue in that way, but it became a cultural thing which was diffuse, which was about what I'm interested in. And these issues of clog, I think, is evidence of that. Is in, we're interested in science fiction. I mean, magazines didn't, if no kind of self-respecting Urasov or Kimmelman will refer to Star Wars when they're reviewing a building, but you can do a whole magazine on that and put it all online, and it's not just that's what people want. It's like that's what we thought architecture was all along. I mean, obviously there's sort of influences from, I would say Building Blog, Jeff is arguably the most popular blogger I've read in architecture in the world, and that's had a huge influence on students and on there's lots of imitators and people participating in that expanded definition of architecture. But I think that's all in all a really fantastic and positive thing, and that's kind of what I'm interested in, is this idea that with a change in media we can rethink actually what it is, and it's a culture, and it involves the conversations, and it involves the people, and it involves the back chat on Twitter, and it involves the and then at some point there's a building, but this idea of architecture is much more diffuse, and perhaps that's why I'm interested in practice, because I'm interested in the kind of life of architecture and the people and the ideas, and I do feel like that stuff all comes to the front.
I think that stuff previously, it was there, but it was there in academic public journals, actually, and it was there in the journals that were produced, that were funded by. Because I think the major thing that structures and constrains what is and isn't in a print publication is the economic model and who's paying for it, and the kind of cultural and economic context that it's produced in. And that kind of has shifted. And so I think that shifting, as well as it's not just the medium, it's that other stuff as well. I mean, professional publications are filled with building reviews, partly because that's an assumption that that's what the advertisers want to see, and they're funded through advertising. And I think we kind of need to understand those economic situations as well. But I might talk more about the building review later, but let's move to Karen.
Can you all hear me? It's very curious to be on this panel because I'm a relic of an age before all of this. And in fact, I have a hard copy of the Oxford English Dictionary at home, and half the words that were in Alexandra's paper aren't in that dictionary. But I was trained in the art of interpretation, so I think I can infer what many of the words mean by the context. So partly I might make some remarks about that transition. You know, in a way, of course, the medium, the technology is really important, but it's not entirely driven by that. So I'd say many of the things, the forms that have appeared in new media are formalisations of conversations that went on before, but they were not recorded. They were oral conversations, they were the dialogue you'd have in the bar at, whatever time of the morning. And the forms that are transferred over, like 500 words, the blog genre, that's the genre for a new work review in the newspaper, in Australian newspapers, perhaps not in the New York Times. And, editors would cut from the bottom up because it's all about fitting it into the column. So, and Megan Morris talks about this in her work on reviewing. I describe Twitter as the haiku of the internet, which unfortunately I find very difficult to use. The long essay, we used to call it the essay review. So the genres of writing, some of which were developed by the ancient Greeks, have persisted. They might find new media, but writing in terms of having a voice as a writer, constructing an audience, constructing a dialogue, those are long forms, and that's about the craft of writing and speaking. So there are important continuities as well. I think one of the most interesting things for me is that formalisation of the unsaid, what formerly didn't have a voice in the public realm, which is very exciting about Parler, about building those global communities. And I've probably just got two things to say about that. I think there's much more discussion of architecture from the bottom up. So the people whose voices weren't heard so much, and I'm going to bore Rory and Justine because they've heard this spiel from me, but I'm fascinated with archi-leaks, the voice of the workers. It fits into a long tradition of labour history, of worker protest, worker grievance. Yes, there are discussions we can have about to what extent it might be objective or malicious, but it uses gossip as a tool of subversion. And this is a really interesting way of speaking and writing.
Maybe you can just explain.
I only know because Justine told me about it. It's not because I know anything about the internet, I have to say.
I probably picked it up from Twitter.
It's an international site where people can anonymously post accounts of their work experience, usually with high-profile architectural practices. So it is really an account of working in an architectural office from the bottom up. It's extremely interesting because it tells us about many of the difficulties of workplace culture in slavery. Architecture. There's a rhetorical term. So there are places like that where you really see architectural culture being discussed from the bottom up.
And I think those discussions used to happen in the pub.
Yeah, exactly. This is my point about formalisation of conversations. And I have to say also, as an Australian working out of Melbourne, I think a really huge positive change has been internationalisation. So now I know what they're doing at MoMA, and I know those amazing exhibitions and programs. It's all there immediately, but equally for an Australian, we're right on the internet, things get recirculated, our work gets picked up elsewhere, and we start having conversations with other people. So there are all those positives about location and site specificity, and we're trained to deal with that in our discipline, but there are negatives as well. And there's a thing about the internationalisation that allows you to build communities outside your own local community where you may not find similar interests or sympathies or political interests. So, and it reduces distance, and it means the person in New York, you're proximate to them, all of a sudden more proximate to them than perhaps the person you work next to. So I think as an Australian that's been a very important change. And I think I've said enough for the moment.
Michael.
Well, I'm going to be really old school and wooden and just kind of read some notes. So as editor of AR, I find myself at a time when the profession needs to be questioning the barriers of entry or establishment, or possibly deviating from the conventions that we as architects and writers either set up or play to. In terms of magazine publications, it's particularly concerning that we find ourselves having to justify our own relevance in this false dichotomy between the end of the imprint and the rise of the online blog. A case in point for such maladjusted thinking is the prophecy of Victor Hugo that the book will kill the building. And it is intriguing to consider then that the start and end point of criticism online, whereby current critical account can be embryonic in the print version, it normally extends to the ether far more rapidly and with greater commentary. In approaching Domus for our series on elements, Marissa and I were without much notable pedigree in terms of printed articles or even blogs. We simply approached them with an idea. We wanted to speculate on what constituted criticism on a contemporary discipline. Our method was simple: to take one single definitive element from one architect or practice and to extrapolate that across the body of work in order to find a critical account as to how the element curates discourse. We wanted to speculate. We had an idea, but we didn't have the vehicle to propel it forward. As practicing architects in New York, Marissa and I were in jobs that were not appealing to our investigative, critical, and speculative nature. Domus, or more precisely Domus Web, their online forum, provided that, and so the series was born. What I find extremely liberating, and something Karen has touched on there from the articles of Domus, is that the word count can be as much or as little as you like. The series that we are writing at the minute has an average of 2,500 words per article. I would struggle as editor of AR to commission that, not just for budgets, but arguably for the fact that many architects wouldn't want to contribute an article of that length. I've begun to break this particular partition down. As similar to Clog, AR will call for submissions, and then there'll be a general to and froing where the articles that don't make it will go online. Don't make it into the magazine will go online. This is not to say the articles aren't worthy, rather that they're more deeply in tune with the research that requires greater length and critique. I think this is crucial, this sense of opportunity of endless word count. What I'm aiming to do is to transform the mode of production in terms of critical account, in project reviews, for instance, but also in development of an architectural position. Alexandra's Design Observer article on the New York Times, former New York Times architecture critic Nikolai Urasov was damning, but is a pressing example to the need for formulating an expression, a position on architecture. And I quote, "What outrages me about Urasov is that he has an opinion about design, but his reviews offer not much more than that opinion. His approach, little history, less politics, occasional urbanism, shrinks the critic's role to commenting only on the appearance of architecture. He might have been a perfect critic for the boom years, but when looks were the selling point, but this formal global approach seems incongruous in a downturn." End quote. A pertinent question is to look at the idea of traditional or canonical forms of criticism, that of the authoritarian voice of the esteemed, established employee of the recognized institution, and to speculate as to whether any kind of critical account can be formed when architecture and building is governed by developer-led agglomerations and contractors. The answer may lie in the fact that the closed book policy of the magazine, which is something I'm trying to dismantle, is somewhat restrictive in the contemporary environment. We've already mentioned it briefly, but this touches on the idea of democracy in criticism. Blogging allows for such democracy. Although someone like Jeff Maynor at Building Blog was an editor prior to his blogging fame, it is interesting to consider him in relation to the democratic voice of architectural discourse. Maynor, along with Alexandra and City of Sound's Dan Hill, amongst others, break down the established norms of potentially restrictive and wholly undemocratic professional hierarchy. Maynor is actually even more intriguing when you look at the content of his critiques. He doesn't necessarily extend beyond architecture as such, but does extend beyond the showcase building reviews and incessant happy backslapping that occurs in much of architectural criticism, not just within the discipline and not bounded by nation. Authors like Alexandra and also Beatrice Colomina also have a great relevance in the breaking down of barriers into architectural criticism. The book at hand today, Writing About Architecture, is almost an investigative manual on how to write in different guises, providing tools for the reader to go away and devise their own critiques, possibly even through blogging. Colomina, moreover, tries to take the actual built form and to analyse it as a vehicle to understand a much larger difficulty or disciplinary problem. Identifying discourse in these ways provides the critic with a better sense of temporality, extending beyond the immediate and allowing for greater historiographic pertinence. However, there's also a danger in this analysis, and something I've tried to deviate from in the Domus series, this tendency towards a marginalisation of what constitutes architecture. It seems only the most notable of projects can be critiqued. Instead of this singular showcase analysis, I've employed a peripatactic approach where I traverse the body of work, analysing a singular element. I'm getting to the point. This despatialises the singular architectural object. It removes it from its necessary context and places it amongst a much broader debate. This sense of despatialisation is key to the understanding of the impact and prominence of online criticism. As editor of AR, our website currently focuses on reproduced articles and previous issues, together with immediate events and activities that are localised to the Australian market. Incidentally, that's something that's going to change in the coming months. And even then, the magazine is just as localised, even though we're called AR Asia Pacific and not just AR Australia. But for the likes of Dezeen and Arc Daily and other such blog platforms that centre on the singular buildings, you don't necessarily have to understand the contextual complexity from which the building comes from. This is not to say that context is overbearingly important, but that the blogosphere opens up debate to a massive audience whose responses may be more governed by what they see and less by what they know. What I find interesting in the debate on criticism in this forum is the potential for speculation in light of despatialised programmes. In days gone by, the likes of Archigram devised methods of representation to portray their ideologies through comic book illustrations, or more recently, the pronouncement of speculative ideals in the representation Koolhaas applied in his Metropolis as Manifesto as book, or Delirious New York, which becomes the device to comment onto the city. So finally, I'll pose a question to both the panel and also to the audience. Through despatialising the content and making it immediate to either consume or discard, what can be said for the method of representation of a critical account?
Well, would anyone like to answer that?
You want to slow down? Okay.
Not the whole thing.
Okay, sure?
Just a question.
Okay. Through despatialising the content and making it immediate to either consume or discard, what can be said for the method of representation of a critical account?
But that assumes that a blog is a bite-sized thing. And I would challenge that first off. I mean, you mentioned earlier that once you're liberated from the magazine or the book, length is no longer an issue.
Right.
And I think we're seeing, I mean, that just means that we can go as long as we like. I just did a 5,000-word essay for Domus. It'll be 3,000 in the magazine, but it'll be full length online. And that's kind of interesting. It's sort of, they want the rest, but they can't afford it. And so we'll put it up when it goes on the web. And Dan, I think, has done the kind of, who curates this series, did 3,000 for the mag and 9,000 for online, plus an interview with another 4 or something. So I don't think that's been I would disagree. I would say that the going online hasn't made it bite-sized or whatever your term was, but it actually allows for more inclusiveness and more expansion and more discussion.
There is the thing about audience too, like what people can bear, how long you can hold people's interest.
9,000 words is, in an online setting is the best thing. But anyway, sorry, go on.
I mean...
I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just...
Yeah.
It's just...
I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about all these digital technologies is the degree to which you have quite immediate reception of your writing. Whereas before, often you would write something and it would just disappear into the void. It was... You very rarely got feedback from people on the piece. And it's very interesting to hear all those different kinds of feedback and this sort of instant loop that's being created. So I'd be wondering too about what kind of effect that has on the medium or people's own writing position.
I always get this kind of anxiety the day one of my articles goes online.
Right.
You know? And even if I've got something else to do, it's like I know I'm going to get a handful of tweets and I'm going to have to respond and somebody's going to interpret it and criticize me. And I get all like, I just kind of want to turn off my phone and come back the next day.
was quite good.
But I think that's actually part of the form now. I mean, I think what's actually interesting and what's a common ground in what all of us have said is that the current state of media just makes it possible to be so much more experimental and in some ways provisional, to try things out, which gives you a great freedom. I mean, this idea of, you know, the conversations I love, because, I mean, I may live in New York, so, you know, some people think that's a center of the architecture world, but, you know, I live in New York, I have 2 small children, I'm a freelancer, so basically I'm alone in my house every day writing. So I need friends on Twitter, you know, I need my water cooler as much as anyone who lives in Australia, you know, as much as anyone anywhere. And I find that incredibly generative, and it, as I said before, it makes me feel like I'm part of a community. But also I've been experimenting with form. We were talking a little bit earlier, like that idea of a dialogue, you know, doing a building review as a dialogue rather than a monologue. I have a friend, Mark Lamster, who lives in my neighborhood. He's also an architecture critic, and we've gone around New York and done building reviews. We call it Lunch with the Critics, and we basically go to a building and then we go to lunch, and we send each other emails back and forth for like an hour and a half, and then we publish an edited version of that. And there's something so much more immediate about it that I think connects with more people, because it is a little less polished, it is a little bit less the old form, and that's the kind of thing that I don't think we would have been thinking about if we both hadn't been having so much fun on Twitter. And you know, there are lots of other examples of that, you know, longer, shorter, all different things. But just this idea, like, oh wait, you know, there's no reason we can't do it this way, and in many cases, it doesn't cost any money to do it a different way.
I think that's great. What I was thinking as well is it's really interesting that there's still such a strong commitment to the authorial voice, though, and the figure of the author. You know, and a lot of interest in that singularity. I'm not saying it either as a negative thing or a positive thing, but I think there's still a strong interest in particular figures and following them.
Yeah, well, I think it might actually be even stronger today. I mean, that's one of the things about, I mean, as a freelance journalist in the new economy, I have to write so much more. And so I know that I end up falling back on certain common tricks. And as I was saying before, you know, sometimes people's knowledge of my personality. So I think the voice almost becomes more important because people have to be following you. And you don't have any other, I mean, you're more exposed in a sense.
Yeah, and if you've got a Twitter account that you don't just use for making professional statements, in fact, that cult of personality is then even more consolidated by those other social media around the authorial voice. I'm neither saying this as a positive or negative thing. I'm just thinking on the run about how interesting this is, that there's this persistence of certain desires and commitments.
Yep, the author just didn't die.
No, and nor should they.
But there are more authors. I mean, there are more authors to choose from. You can read more authors. I mean, so I teach a class in architecture criticism, and one of the exercises we do in the class is I take my whole class to a building. We get the architect to give us a tour, and then we go back and all the students write a review, and then we workshop a review. And the fundamental lesson of that is we've all seen the same thing. We've all heard the same talk from the architect, and what the students come up with can be diametrically opposed and from all different angles. And it's just the best lesson in the world, and the fact that, you know, criticism is a personal thing, and there are so many ways to do it. And it's just great for the students, you know, especially I call them, you know, fledgling critics, to see that and to help each other achieve, you know, their better voice. I mean, it's just a great exercise, and I have to say I always feel a little bit like their therapist after I've read a bunch of their essays.
But this point of the author is really interesting. I mean, I feel like we have a kind of glut of columnists you know, in the Age in particular, or in the newspapers here, it seems to be that there's a lot of I think, or it's starting with what you saw on the weekend, and it's very sort of conversational. Maybe architecture needs something more equivalent to The Economist, you know, which is a kind of, there's no tagline, there's no personality curated, it's just like, and I'm not suggesting it needs to be objective. The Economist is quite, you know, playful and takes strong positions occasionally, but that perhaps these people are getting in the way of the content.
I mean, I think, well, yeah. I mean, I think certainly when I would, you know, back in the day, when I would commission criticism, and it was most often a building review, you know, you would be trying very hard to commission someone who I thought would be able to stage some kind of productive encounter with the subject matter, whether it's a building or an exhibition or, you know, it's something, a kind of thematic discussion which I knew their research or practice would lend them to be able to do. So you want to have somebody who's going to bring something to the consideration of the issue, but you don't want somebody who's just in love with the sound of their own voice. And I think that's the thing that you're doing as you're writing is you're staging an encounter. And so I would always want the critic to bring something with them to that building. I don't want them sitting down writing out what the architect thought they were doing. And I also don't want them just to kind of slam it through or praise it through some kind of unconsidered kind of diatribe. I mean, I think you want someone who, well, for me, you want someone who will quite carefully think their way through, but you want someone who will write the review that maybe, you know, Karen will write a review that would be very different to the review you would write, and you kind of think about that. And for me, you know, again, as an editor, one of the lovely things is that people don't say what you think they'll say. And they know things that you don't know they know, and they'll bring another kind of view to it. And so you kind of always, you know, whatever you're doing is bigger than what you intend when you commission, but you do nonetheless, I think, you want someone who's got something to say, but who will respect the work, but bring their knowledge with them in this kind of thoughtful way. And so I suppose I don't disagree about, you know, the kind of boringness of the building review as a form, but I also am very reluctant to give it away completely. And I think there is opportunity in it, but I think that opportunity is when the critic finds a way to use the building to open a kind of discussion and to say something about the other things one would want to talk about. Yeah, I think so.
I'm interested in. Sorry, you go. I've talked enough.
Well, because we did say we weren't going to spend too much time talking about the project review, so I was just going to twist it some other way for them. Well, what's happened to the commissioning editor? I mean, has the internet changed that role? I don't have any position on it.
Well, it's been very interesting if I talk about myself, it's been very interesting shifting from being the editor of a print publication, which was the Journal of Record, to being the editor of an online publication. And that involved a much more significant shift, I think, than I understood. And thank goodness I had Peter Johns of Butterpaper, who helped, was building the site, kind of helping me figure my way through that. But I think I still run that, and there's only commission people I ask them to write. I edit their work, I send it back to them to review, so I still run it in probably a more traditional editorial way, because to a degree that's my training. But I do think the role of the editor is quite important, but it's a different thing than a blog. And I think I like the unfilteredness of a blog, but I also think there's a role for something which is crafted in other ways. Yeah.
I was going to ask a really obvious question, potentially obvious question. What is the kind of cumulative point of it all, at the end of the day? I mean, what happens? I mean, you said there was 11 critics in the whole of North America.
11.5.
And how many are you graduating each year?
Oh, at DCRIT, you
Yes.
mean? Well, I mean, DCRIT, and we're accepting applications right now, by the way, if anyone's interested. DCRIT is broader than architecture criticism. I mean, in fact, it's a design criticism program, and most people do not come there to write about architecture because
I'm certainly not
Oh,
suggesting that they're all
but-
vying for this New York Times
No.
architecture critic one
Yeah.
position for
Yeah.
400 people.
No, but I
But
mean,
what is the effect on the city when we have all these citizen
Oh, okay.
critics who think in this,
Oh, well, this-
more analytical way?
Yeah.
Does it feed back into design? Or is it just is it for them?
Well, I guess to me that's actually two different things. Like the Decrypt program, we are training people to be critical of design in general. Our students are going on to be a lot of different things: blog editors, curators, design writers. One set of students started their own design consultancy and they're editing books. They've launched the Architecture and Design Book Club series in New York that's been very successful. So we see criticism as a tool that then you can take into a lot of other roles than being a critic. When I talk in my book about citizen critics, I'm actually talking more about lay people. I feel like lay people want to have more of an effect on their cities, and I see a real gap between the vocabulary that architects use and the gap that most people use in talking about their cities, and I'm hoping that my book could prove to be a way of bridging that gap. I mean, in New York City, we have this thing called community boards, and so anytime an architect wants to build something in a particular neighborhood that's not as of right, they have to present it to the community board. And too often, I see the architects come in and they have their plans and they do their spiel, and then people get up and say things, but there's no impact of what they say because they're not speaking the same language. And I'm hoping that by reading something like my book and understanding the work of all these great critics in the American tradition that are included in the book, they can figure out ways to have more of an impact on what architects are doing in their cities. Like, I don't think criticism is only for critics. I think everyone needs to be more critical of the built environment, and that should empower them to do something about it.
Yeah, that's what I thought was one of the most interesting chapter in your book, was this reproduction of a Michael Sorkin review of not a built building, but of Michael Graves'
addition to the Whitney Museum. Yeah.
Which was so scathing and potentially had an impact on the public reception of this proposal, and potentially stopped it in its tracks. And hopefully it can also work the other way, that we don't just use criticism for the sake of NIMBYism, but to promote the stuff that we want to have, and in that sense, that it's kind of more activist, or more, it can play a role in the outcome rather than just understanding the result.
So if you give the citizen critic the language to actually make comment, how do they then change the way traditional criticism is formed?
I think they would probably be more challenging of it.
Yeah.
And feel more in dialogue and more equal to the critic. I feel like, maybe the downside of the traditional city critic was that critic ended up having potentially a lot of power over what happened, because they were part of an institution like a newspaper that, again, in the old days, could have a significant role in the shaping of a city. I think this is much diluted today. But also, people came to believe that critic, and if there was only one critic, that was the voice. And I think as people feel more empowered, it's just, you can have more of a dialogue. I would say there was recently a completely opposite example of the kind of dialogue that you can have in New York City. There are plans, Norman Foster has been drawing up plans to renovate the New York Public Library, and Michael Kimmelman in the New York Times wrote this very scathing review, though I personally think it could have been even more scathing because I did not like the scheme at all. And in the New York Times, as I felt was his prerogative and really his duty as the New York Times critic, when something's going to happen to a major landmark in the city. And Norman Foster wrote a letter to the New York Times saying that Kimmelman's criticism had been offensive and premature, which I felt was in fact offensive in a whole different way, because how could they be premature when now is the time when we can change things? And it was just, I mean, it was really an astonishing moment for, I think, an architect to, you know, kind of step out from behind the curtain and challenge that.
Foster's ever said anything. He never teaches, never writes, never does anything. That's I think it's the interesting thing with architects at the minute. There's a kind of insular aspect to them. They don't want to extend outside and kind of teach to other people. And I think that's, like Foster to actually make a comment is incredible, because architects don't make comments anymore.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I wondered if there was a backstory to it. But, yeah.
I love that piece. I thought that Kim Win piece was great. And you're right. You know, it's, you know, there's a point where major public buildings, it just has to be called out that this isn't good enough, and you want to be saying that before, not after.
Right, and I think,
right.
I mean, and I think the traditional best role of the critic is to hold architects accountable. I mean, you know, their ultimate duty, and this is something that I think, you know, Ada Louise Huxtable, who recently died, who's really sort of my beau ideal of the critic, always had this sense that she was writing for the public. You know, the public was her client, and so if people were not serving the public properly, whether they were developers, architects, or the city government, you know, they needed to be held accountable. And that's exactly what that piece did. I mean, that's when it's great to have a platform like the New York Times, because people pay attention.
But pre-internet, there's no way I would have been reading that, you know, in
my
suburban house.
Circulation.
You know,
why would you read that?
Yeah, I think it's.
But I'm just thinking, I mean, I think it is problematic if we still think about this conversation in very old-fashioned terms, the public, the architects, the critic is the mediating figure, because there are so many important non-architectural knowledges about architecture and the built environment. I mean, architecture with an A, non-architectural, and many of them, as people working in architecture, we've been entranced by. So the knowledge of the city and the built environment that's produced by works of fiction, for example, that's been such an important contribution to our cultural sense of the built environment. People have their own vernacular knowledges about architecture and space. So for me, surely new media technologies are a way where those can enter into greater dialogue with us. And, you know, now people have phone apps you can do where you can walk around Melbourne, and I'm sure New York, where you can walk around with access to very important works of fiction about those sites. But the internet should also find a platform for people who have those vernacular knowledges too, for us to engage with, rather than this, you know, very traditional sense of the public, the critic, and the architectural community. I would want to see all that reconfigured.
Well, I think architecture fiction is actually a very popular thing online. I think it's been revived. I mean, I think that's one of the communities of common interest. I know in my class in the fall, I did a session on retail and stores, and I assigned the famous chapter from Émile Zola's Lady's Paradise about the store in that book, just to kind of as an atmospheric piece on the idea of shopping and the frenzy. And the students really appreciated that, and a lot of them brought that kind of fiction into their reviews of the store that we ended up visiting as a class.
I think I just want to return to maybe the question of distance, because I think it's distance and power, I guess. So I think to some degree we have, you know, we've always operated in a globalised world. There's always been images and writings and drawings circulate. It's happening much, much faster now. I agree. I mean, when I started as editor of AA, I had almost no colleagues, and, you know, the person who did the job closest to me was my opposition. So, and certainly Twitter, for me, gave me this whole sense of a kind of of colleagues, which was fantastic. But I just think it's not either or, and I don't think that it's entirely erased distance. And I don't think I think questions of distance and questions of power structures are being challenged and they're being reformed, but we're not on some kind of idealised equal playing field either. So I think one of the things is to to think critically about that as well. I think it's very easy to go, oh, everyone's got access to it now and it's all just fabulous. It's kind of not quite that straightforward, I think.
I've noticed this interesting transition in the different ways that this media's been taken up, in that it's sped up to the point where location has become relevant again. So perhaps, 20 years ago we were isolated and the magazines would come on the boat every 2 months, and that's sort of how we kept up with the world, to put it very simply. And then, online, and the blogs and the conversations that happen within those communities would happen over a number of days through the comment streams, and it sort of levelled it a bit, and it became very possible to participate here on a very equal sense. But now I've noticed that with Twitter, the conversation that you see in your thing is totally geographic, or it's not. It's based on your time zone. So the people that I actually miss people on Twitter because they're not awake anymore. All my friends who are in the UK, which I would talk to from Amsterdam, and you can have this live conversation that's with all these people, and the UK has an incredible amount of architecture critics, probably twice as many as the US even. Yeah. And so all these guys are just, it's incredible conversation happening over there, which you either have to stay up all night here to participate in, or just kind of wait for it to come around again.
Yes, I think we might open to questions and comments. So we've got a roving mic here. So has anybody, we've got 2 roving mics even. Who would like to say something?
Can I make a quick comment?
Yes.
You mentioned about critical comment on buildings in our city. Recently we had that Melbourne magazine, Melbourne's Worst Buildings, I think it was. Everyone might remember that. I made a comment in there. I got a rap on the knuckles from the institute, from the institute for writing something. What are we supposed to do with that?
Yes, well, none of us represent the institute. I think the institute.
Isn't there part of the articles that you're not allowed to bring the profession into disrepute in the public sphere?
Yes, and I think I think they probably take a fairly conservative view of what that is, but yeah.
I don't know, I don't belong.
Simon.
But isn't it true that Norman Day had to quit the institute because he wasn't able to be as outspoken as he wanted to be in The Age?
Which I think is just a very impoverished version of
That might be a myth. That's
what criticism is. I don't know.
I was sort of interested in the discussion beyond the kind of idea of the pure review or the critique, because I think it's kind of limited in actually achieving much in architecture and the built environment, and more about the sort of educative role of a discussion about architecture and a discourse about architecture. And I think that's much more relevant in actually, I guess, creating a discourse between the public and architects, and it's a two-way street in terms of what the public might want and also what architects can deliver, and also foster a greater understanding of what the architectural process is, because I think a lot of people don't understand what that is, and buildings that sometimes take years to kind of develop through quite complex political and social kind of streams, and why the outcome has happened in such a way. So I think, there's a sort of discussion beyond the sort of critique about, I think, there's sort of banal kind of conversations about sort of, is it the best or worst building, are fairly limited. And sometimes I think the Twitter sort of stuff falls down into that sort of category about a pure critique or yes or no or a like or a hit a button of whether I think a building is good or not. And there's far more value in architecture critics sort of talking about the profession and what an architect is in fact trying to achieve. And for me as an architect and a critic, I find those discussions much more empowering, much more enlightening.
I mean, I think the people who are doing some of the most important advocacy work are the curators at MoMA. And I think MoMA has produced a stunning series of exhibitions around really important themes, and they're rethinking what the curation and exhibition of architecture is, because they're focusing on process, they're focusing on having architects and other designers, professionals in residence working on local projects, and then you've got that sort of live entry into the design thinking and design formation process. The CCA, the NAI, I think curators, these new breed of curators are actually at the forefront of fantastic advocacy and engagement.
Okay, sorry, someone else has got the mic. So
I just wanted to bring the discussion back to a point made, or something pointed to by Rory earlier, in relation to how these critiques gain traction in practice and in informing future built work. And I suppose I want to make a link there between how we see people practicing and how we educate those practitioners. And do you think that beyond various schools that are doing things, interesting things with exploring the role of critique as something distinct but also something critical in the design process, are we actually breeding critical capacities amongst our students? Are we breeding practitioners that actually are practitioners actually as well versed as we think in the desire and possess vocabulary to actually engage productively in critiquing the work, let alone just limiting that discussion to whether the public can do that? I'd question whether the majority of practitioners can productively engage in that kind of discussion.
To speak as a designer, I would say that we've talked about the kind of direct relationship potentially between a piece of criticism, like what Sorkin did in New York about an unbuilt project. But for me, the influence of criticism is much slower. I remember, there's a handful of really terrific reviews which stand out for me and have really shaped the way I think about architecture. And most of the people who wrote them are here. Like, Alex Selenich wrote a fantastic review of a project that I worked on that Simon, when I was working for Simon, which was rethought this project, which was a sort of toilet block on a highway as a frame for reorienting your perspective in the landscape. It was a piece that Justine commissioned, and it's not something that we'd thought of at all in the design of it, but it's something that I've thought of subsequently. And a piece of Karen's, I remember maybe 10 years ago, a review of Ellenberg Fraser's tower on Spencer Street. And this idea that a very autonomous thing can relate to a field of possibility or of these networks of freeways which you look out to, and it went into the kind of psychology of a person living there almost, was also something that has kind of stayed with me as a designer. So I think that there's that very immediate role for the critic in a city to be on their toes and to be responsible and to be an urbanist. But there's also the kind of cumulative effect on this kind of thinking which we should be paying attention to and feeding back into our own work.
So there's
I think this young man.
yes, sorry.
I just find it, I guess, very interesting in terms of how things are actually moving online. And but I sort of wonder a bit about the online environment, because the thing about anonymity, and I suppose the way that you do post things online are sometimes quite instantaneous. I suppose you don't actually put a lot of thoughts into it, and I suppose the legitimacy of the critique can be undermined, because sometimes, as you know, with politicians and their Twitter feeds, they lose control and lose sight on what they actually post. And I suppose that's not really, I don't know, I just wonder whether architectural reviews are going the way the restaurant reviews are with Urban Spoon and I suppose the other blog website as well, whether that's actually the way forward. And I guess if you're actually hiding behind the mask online, you can just post whatever you want, really, without being credible if you are wrong, or sometimes there's that, I suppose,
never read
bravado.
comments.
But I haven't seen that. So, I don't feel like we have Yelp for buildings. Do we have Yelp here? Or the equivalent?
Urban Spoon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see that happening. It might be fun, like what I was talking before about kind of the provisionality and the potential for experiment. It might be fun to try to provoke that sometime, actually, but I guess I don't see that happening so much for architecture. I think that there are more people writing about architecture, sometimes on their own blogs, but that is, they are usually not anonymous.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
I think you've got to trust in an intelligent reader. I always thought that as a writer. You know, you have to trust that you're talking to someone who's smart and is capable of making judgment themselves. Then you can't talk down to people and patronise them. And if you say stupid things, you've got to expect there's going to be a whole lot of intelligent people who are going to bounce it back. I mean, I've been rampaging around the last couple of weeks complaining about the piece that Martin Filler wrote on Snowhedger in the New York Review of Books, and I photocopied it to give it to Justine to read. She was like, "Oh, Karen, no, it's been all over Twitter." So it's like
that. I just think it's been taken apart.
I read that. What was your issue with it?
Oh, there was the racism. For a start, I had an issue with that. I thought it was an incredibly... they just need to man up and then they'll be okay. Holding Philip Johnson up is a role model of how you deal with your client group. Those were at least three of the objections I had. Anyway, but, you know, people, it will bounce back. People are smart and they will respond.
I also think, as Alexandra said at the beginning, the medium doesn't determine the form. The medium opens up opportunity and closes down opportunity, but it's also the social and political and economic structures around the medium. I mean, the great thing about Twitter is if someone's talking nonsense, you just stop following them. So, you know, I mean, I think, you kind of make your... So, yeah, there are a lot of people talking a lot of nonsense, but I think the potential of... And, you know, there's a lot of blogs out there that very few people read. So
it's like a diary, really.
You know,
Someone just puts their diary online.
So I think you kind of... I mean, I've always been very interested in reception, but I think it really makes that much more apparent. You can tell how many people are reading things. I can tell on Parler which ones are really going off and which ones aren't, and which ones are a slow burn. And I think that's very interesting, but I don't think because it's online means it's ill-considered. But it can be. But, you know, there's a lot of ill-considered stuff in the newspaper. There's a lot of ill-considered stuff.
Everywhere.
There's a lot of, but it's kind of as you say, it's formalising the chit-chat from the pub that normally we would not have had access to if we weren't at the right dinner party, for example. And for me, when I started AA and started Twitter, it was fantastic because I did it. I got access to the conversations that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't been at the right dinner party. But, you know, you filter. You just have to filter because really there's a lot of nonsense out there, but there's some very good things as well, and there's some very good long-form commentary, and I think that it was a mistake to imagine that online environments are only about the short, sharp. Having said that, Roy did use the phrase, the Twitterisation of research the other day, which did kind of make me just want to go and sit in the library and read things. Anyway, one more.
Don's got a question.
Don.
We're going to let the Dean speak.
Well, I'm not sure it's that relevant anymore, but I felt like that in your discussion it would have been useful to make maybe a stronger distinction between the different audiences for criticism, because it keeps coming around to sounding like, oh, we really need to get the public on board and get them interested. And actually, I know as an architect, the most influential critical texts that I know are for architects. They're not for the public. Yep. They got nothing. I mean, some people may read them and they're intelligent, wonderful pieces, but they're really architectural criticism for architects who want to become architects through criticism. Do you know what I mean? And so therefore I think that even in the kind of categorization between whether there's an anxiety that newspapers are no longer employing architectural critics, when I don't know the historic facts, but it seems to me they didn't exist a long time ago either.
No.
And they only came into being in a period of time and are now maybe fading away in a period of time. And they're very different from country to country, as somebody said. You know, in the UK, all of the major magazines have architectural critics, whereas here, you know, we're lucky to get an article once every 2 months, although some people are trying more. But that's a very different regime than, magazines and journals that are, particularly professional journals, which have one kind of, and then there are and not whether they're academic or not, something like Log, which is, it's not part of any university, but it's still a form of critique and criticism and architectural discussion that I think is very, very important, and it doesn't try to talk to the public.
Yep. I absolutely agree. I think it's I think it's incredibly important that there are forums in which the profession, in its broadest sense, which includes, academia and includes people who are government or whatever, can have a conversation. I think that's really important. But and I agree there are crossover audiences, but I absolutely agree. But again, if we think about the kind of way that one might build communities of interest in online environments, I think, we can do that through professional journals. We can do it, but you can have more specific encounters in it, and if you're kind of building, what am I trying to say? I'm very interested in the way that you can almost hone in more detail on communities of interest, which is, I think, what we've done with Parlour, at the same time as we're trying to really ramp up a broader discussion amongst the profession. But actually it's, so I think there's lots of opportunity.
That's why I was talking earlier about publics and people who have other knowledges about architecture who are not architects, because even within the discipline of architecture itself, there are many, many divisions, good divisions, differences of opinion. There are architectures, not architecture anymore, and I think we now have many more platforms to have those conversations and have multiplicity around very different kinds of practice, very different positions. So,
and I think a lot of the discussion, some of the discussions that we might want to have been going on, but they've been going on in venues which have very small audiences, or they're going on within academic conferences, where no one who's not an academic mostly goes, except occasionally, So I also would like to find ways to sort of activate that space between academia and the profession, and in a kind of more productive way, because I think you're right. I think there are divisions within which sometimes are useful. Sometimes you want to have that confined conversation, and sometimes you want to have a more engaged conversation.
Sorry, just to jump in again. But I'm curious relative to Alexandra's course. I mean, she talked about that the course is for criticism in general. It's not specifically architectural necessarily, but and the comment previously to mine in terms of within schools, how critical is the work, or how critical is the thought or the instruction that's taking place. So I'm interested, I guess, personally more in not criticism as a job description, but criticism as an act of creative knowledge, and the degree to which using the specificity of that vocation, in other words, having students who only want to be architects but actually have to spend at least a semester doing critical writing in order to understand how that feeds back into the creative process, as opposed to seeing it as the critics versus the practitioners versus the public in a certain way.
I have to say, so I teach in 2 programs, but neither of them is an architecture school. That said, my publisher thinks that the market for my book is people teaching in architecture school. They wouldn't have published it if they didn't think that there was a need and desire for courses like mine in architecture schools. And I know, my book's been out a year now, and it is being course adopted in a number of schools. I do think, in general, in architecture education, at least in the US now, there's starting to be more of a focus on writing and communication, and so courses based on my book are a way of making that part of the educational process and more of a tool, part of the architect's arsenal, to be able to write, even if it's just as a way to be able to speak. So I think there's definitely, an interest in a market. I can't speak to, personal experience of working with architecture students in that way.
I think it's cyclical too. Like in the late 80s, there was a rash of deconstructive writing everywhere, and you'd you'd go to a studio crit, someone would stand up and they would be channeling bits of Derrida. And so,
I was educated at exactly that moment.
There's a kind of historical trajectory as well. Well, yes, if people knew what they were doing. But sometimes it was more like a sort of surrealist performance. And I have taught critical writing to architecture students at various points in my career. So there's a historical desire that waxes and wanes too. And after the digital turn, when the interest in writing, I think, really collapsed, what's interesting to me is to see the writerly turn that's happened in the last couple of years. So it goes and comes.
Well, I think it's good. The idea there's a writerly turn, I think that might be a good place to end. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to our panel, and thank you very much to Alexandra.
Yes, thanks for coming today.